podcast.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and we are back for the final Q&A with Gary and Aaron at the end of the Theology for Troublemakers class. Now, the last lecture, actually the last two, Gary reworked after the class began based on what's going on in our world and the kinds of questions that kept showing up because we had way more questions than you can fit in to just these few hours, which might make you jealous after last week of Charlene and Aaron's experience at Union. But we're excited for today. If you are just joining or listening and want to get the full lectures, you can head over to homebrewedclasses.com and get access to those. Though the only way you're getting those questions answered is if you send them or bring them to Theology Beer Camp, where we can ask Gary more stuff. Very excited for this today. And Aaron, now I want to let you ask the first question. But before that, when we had the idea of doing this class, I was excited and pumped, and I had no idea it would be this much fun and cover as much. I'll let you take over, and you can get to asking the first question. But I just wanted you to know our phone call that had this class as an idea, I had no idea it would be this good. And I'm like a Dorrien head. I have all the books.
Yeah,
So
I know.
it was even better than expected.
That's high praise because, we're a colleague and I, Demian Wheeler, are editing Gary's Festschrift now, and you're one of the contributors. And goodness, when you talked to me about that chapter, before you even sent it, I think you held me on the phone for about an hour, talked to me about how you read all of his books, went back through them. This is what you thought. What about that? And I was like, okay, what's your word limit? You're like, or what's your word count? I'm like, okay, I'm about 15 pages too long. I was like, okay, we got it. So when you say you're a Dorrien head, you really are a Dorrien head. You dived in, and this is true. When Gary gets going, he really gives his whole heart to things, friends, as we've seen. And it's been such a gift to have Gary have that section, have week 3 on his own story, go pick up the memoir. You can see how so much of his work, the histories that you're receiving here, may just appear because Gary is such a good narrative weaver and storyteller that he's just kind of giving you the stories. You don't realize how constructive they are, how intentional he is with the ways he's telling the stories. And there have been points in previous conversations when other students have been like, did you know that this figure might have been read this way? Yeah, Gary knows. He's intentionally skirted around it because of certain issues. So he's intentional. We end today starting with Kelly Brown Douglas. In his lecture, we start with Du Bois and conversations around double consciousness. However, the questions that we want to start is where we end in one of the big figures in his lecture. So I kind of want to jump in there. Your lecture this week, Gary, builds to a discussion of Kelly Brown Douglas's argument in her book, Resurrection Hope. How do you assess the overall significance of her work as a theologian?
So I'm actually thrilled that we're going to this right away because indeed, I've just loaded for stuff to say about Kelly because I go way back with her. It's customary to say that the founders of womanist theology are Jackie Grant, Katie Cannon, and Dolores Williams. But Kelly was a classmate and a friend of all the founders of Union. She participated in their discussions of whether they should even call themselves womanists. She made the decision at the same time they did. And she wrote The Black Christ during the same period that Dolores wrote Sisters in the Wilderness. So I have always described Kelly as one of the 4 womanist founders. Moreover, she is the one founder who made a continuous stream of contributions to the movement by writing theology for it. One book after another that responds to a pressing crisis or problem, and she's still doing so. Kelly's book, What's Faith Got to Do with It?, interrogated the historic Christian denigration of embodiment and sexuality. Her book, Sexuality in the Black Church, bravely criticized the heteronormative sexism of the Black Church. Her book, Stand Your Ground, was a landmark response to losing Trayvon Martin, conducting a genealogy of white U.S. American anti-Blackness. Her book, as we said in the lecture, Resurrection Hope, was a response to the many who were cut down between Trayvon in 2012 and George Floyd in 2020. Kelly persistently puts her existential struggle for faith. Kelly persistently puts her existential struggle for faith and hope at the center of everything she writes. She is a womanist and a liberationist. She denies that you have to choose between these commitments. Her books feature her affinities with James Baldwin, her debt to Michel Foucault, her aversion to any theology of the cross, and her belief that the church must be the primary locus of womanist and liberationist theology. The Black Christ conveys its argument in the title. Christ identifies with the oppressed, so he cannot be white. The only Black theology deserving of the name repudiates the white Christian shaming of Black people with a white Christ. Kelly said that nothing less than a full-fledged affirmation of physical Blackness, cultural Blackness, and existential Blackness is liberating for Black people. For many years, she was Cohen's strongest supporter on ontological Blackness, and she resisted the Victor Anderson critique of it. At the same time, throughout the 1990s, Kelly's classroom at Howard University felt like a battleground to her because she taught and wrote that the Black church must stop denigrating gay and lesbian persons. Many of her students angrily told her that she couldn't be more wrong. Gay sexuality is sinful and it's a violation of Black culture. Year after year, Kelly wanted to avoid this subject in class, but she was compelled by her conscience to take another battering. Meanwhile, her book came out and she faced up to being a very public figure on this subject. It ended up defining her in a way that she had not planned. She was just responding to a crisis in the life of the church and American society and of people that she loved. She takes from Baldwin a strong emphasis on the importance of naming and repudiating white culture. In Baldwin's metaphor, whiteness is the ticket to social, political, cultural, and economic status in the USA. She has long held forth against all versions of the denial that white people have a culture or that racism is a cultural system. The fact that there are progressive, even lefty versions of both denials has provoked some of her most scathing writing against writers who clutch at shreds of innocence and at others who are willing to criticize whiteness as long as they get to reap some benefits from it. Marxism, for example, is an option unto itself. Because Marxism denies that white culture exists. What exists are white power and privileges within capitalist society. Kelly grades Marxism higher than liberalism, but only slightly. She supplements Baldwin with Foucault, adopting the concept of power as omnipresent relations of power. Foucault argued that power ascends from the bottom upward, always met by multiple points of resistance that constitute the relations of power. Wherever power exists, which is everywhere, resistance exists. There's no single locus or source of resistance. Kelly adopts Foucault's contention that power is disciplinary, pervasive, and productive. In Sexuality in the Black Church, she said, sexuality is integral to power as the axis where the human body and social reproduction come together. Kelly is one of my dearest friends in the world, and she and I are both canon theologians at the Cathedral Church of St. Ludovine, so our differences have been aired out here and there. I am very much a cross theologian in the line of Abelard, Luther, Hegel, Niebuhr, Cohn, Moltmann, and others, and I'm a philosophical theologian indebted to Schelling, Hegel, and William Temple. Kelly struggles to keep a straight face when I run through my arguments about why some of these people matter so much to me. Moreover, I've never believed any of us will ever witness what she calls God's just future. To Kelly, Christian hope is defined precisely by a belief in the realization of God's just future. I have never had that even for a moment. I came in with Rauschenbusch. We shall never see the kingdom, but we must seek it with faith, giving thanks for every approximation to it that the love of God occasions on earth. Kelly agreed with Dolores Williams from the beginning that redemption must be found in life, not in suffering and death, although Cohn was slow to realize it. So Kelly endured one of his epic harangues once he did realize it. Kelly also agreed with Joanne Terrell, however, that Williams repudiated too categorically the entire tradition of spirituality on this subject. The cross is an existential symbol that God is with those who suffer. But cross spirituality and cross piety, Kelly said, is mostly harmful. Moreover, every attempt to construe sacrifice as redemptive, including Terrell's, must be rejected. God's response to the death of Jesus was to raise him from the dead. The only redemption in the axis of Good Friday and Easter, Kelly argued, is that God raised the body of Jesus to life. Then, George Floyd was cut down. And Kelly realized that she did not reject redemptive sacrifice quite as categorically as she said. If you see the Black Christ in the faces of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, how do you not view them as a sacrifice for sin that redeems society from anti-Black racism? If we say that the crucifixion of Jesus was a spectacle lynching, shouldn't we also say that George Floyd died to save America? Look at the protests that erupted after he was killed. When Kelly began to write Resurrection Hope, as I said in the lecture, she questioned whether she would still be a Christian by the end of the book. She had never believed in redemptive suffering. Yet here she was, writing a book that responded to the redemptive suffering of George Floyd and so many others. It matters, she said, that Jesus is one with the Black crucified and not with white crucifiers. But there must be something beyond the cross that anticipates the joy coming in the morning. In her next to last draft of Resurrection Hope, she wrote, I got a note on this because I got to get this quote. The cross does not allow us to imagine a new life that is not predicated on Black sacrificial death. That was a major step up for her. And her editor, Robert Ellsberg, asked to rewrite that sentence because the double negative was confusing. Why not just say that the cross is only about death and the hope of Christianity is a new life, which she had said for years before? Indeed, of course, Bob was right. The double negative is confusing. So Kelly crossed it out. Yet that sentence expressed the kernel of an argument that she has continued to wrestle with and to write about. It's coming, and she said it last year at Beer Camp. We do have a crucifixion at the center of our faith. Jesus was crucified because he opposed everything that obstructs God's just future. And the new life of Easter faith is predicated on that cross. I have one last point to make about Kelly's work. I could go on, but I've got to at least get this last one in. She is the leading proponent of a twofold argument that the primary locus of womanist theology must be the Black church, and that Black theology must be an agent of activist contagion that builds social justice organizations. On the church issue, she says and has always said that there is no substitute for the church with all its problems. On the activist issue, she has carried on for 40 years the Gayrod Wilmore argument that being involved in political activism is not optional. In both cases, she has implored friends and colleagues not to retreat behind the walls of seminaries and universities. One person who has greatly appreciated Kelly's advocacy on this subject for many years is the U.S. Senator from Georgia, Raphael Warnock. Raphael was elected to the Senate in the same month that Kelly wrote Resurrection Hope. She was there when a street outside the White House was officially named Black Lives Matter Plaza. A moment that hit her. Kelly wrote that it felt like a taste of God's just future. No one at the plaza, she said, pulled rank or claimed that they were superior to anyone else. They were living in the peace that is justice, embodying the future that she refuses not to believe in. All right. Thanks, Aaron.
The next question comes from Cyrus, who said that throughout the lecture series, Niebuhr, Cone, Cannon, Du Bois, you keep bringing up the cross. After this court has gutted the Voting Rights Amendment, what does the cross say to a movement that thought democracy was the floor?
Thank you, Cyrus. Of course, everything in this lecture is about this good skin. So, indeed, I went on for 50 minutes about it. In the lecture, and there are aspects of it I think we're just going to keep folding out here today. So I think I'm going to go over a couple of things just right at the center of even though the way that you put it here. And I think, firstly, I'll just say, I would not say that democracy was ever the floor for the social gospel. Firstly, I believe that liberal democracy is better than democracy, and that multicultural, multiracial democracy is better yet. And that multicultural, multiracial social democracy is even better. And I also believe, as we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, that Niebuhr was right about democracy. The crucial thing about it is that it's a break against the greed and will to power of privileged groups. The chief value of democracy is negative, as resistance to domination. That democratic will to resist oppression and empire must be rekindled in every generation, because the forces against it are relentless and relentlessly self-interested, always seeking to dominate. Certainly for me, as for many of the people we discussed in this class, the cross is the heart and symbol of the gospel. To me, it's the truest thing in Christianity, and I've always felt that way. So I said it plainly, and in some ways, some part of my attraction to the black social gospel and even favoring it over the white social gospel had to do with this, and has had to do with it from a long way back.
Yeah.
All right. I do deeply respect that many Christians have never felt this way. Some of them have deeply important spiritual reasons for contending that the cross wrongly crowds out the ministerial life and teaching of Jesus. It's inherently problematic and strange. It does have this capacity to kind of hurdle you off into directions or to create all these atonement theologies that are just get in the way of actual salvation. And so all the arguments against this, these are long-time arguments in liberal theology. A couple of nights ago, I was with some longtime dear friends who have never in their entire careers preached a sermon on the cross and are quite proud of it. They just can't even what and Cone and people like me say about it. And then Dolores Williams has brilliantly refashioned a version of that argument in womanist theology. People do hear the gospel in different ways. And it's the hearing of the gospel that is the heart of the social gospel. I think not an argument per se about democracy. We do have some questions coming that are going to explore other aspects of this question. I think I will just say this as directly as possible. Much of the social gospel tradition in the white church did push the cross to the sideline to make an argument for social ethical religion. I have long believed that the greater spiritual depth of the black church tradition owes much to the fact that it has a long history of gathering at the cross and preaching that God identifies with us in our suffering. My view is that Du Bois and King and Niebuhr and Cone and Jackie Grant and Cornel West are right about the cross, and that it needs to fold together with social justice religion. The growth, even within the social gospel, you could even, especially there. And just saying, in discussing Kelly, which of course is why King lifted up the image of the beloved community as the unifying symbol. All right, thank you.
The next question here comes from Phoebe, picking up on this. Saying you opened this series with Ida Wells and Reverdy Ransom and end with Kelly and William Barber. What thread holds the Black social gospel together across 140 years of struggle?
Oh, thank you, Phoebe. Yes, this too is a question that goes for what this whole lecture was about. I am in fact going for a thread. There's a thread argument. It's not about that whole subject and indeed about everything else we've done in this course. So I think I'll begin by saying that I think only one thing has always truly united all Black churches. And that one thing is anti-racism. It's to holding off the racism of the dominant society. They're founded on that basis. And it's just undeniable what the founding moment is that propels the founding of Black denominations. You could say, no, of course, almost all Black churches also make a claim about the Christian gospel per se. And of course, that's very important, that sort of gospel centerpiece. But here we get into the fact that Black churches cover the entire waterfront of theologies, ideologies, social philosophies, ecclesiastical positions, and so on. So in terms of all the usual arguments that we have in theology about all these, all the pluralism that's there within all the groups that we identify, oh my goodness, it's all there within Black church Christianity as well. The one thing that unites just all the Black religious communities, even you Black communities, religious communities, is just the sheer having to hold off on the racism of the dominant society. The Black church was born liberationist. Hearing a message of freedom in Christianity, that was not what was preached to enslave people. But the founding liberationist impulse of Black faith was truncated into forms of survival religion and revival spirituality after the Civil War, especially after the Civil War. The social gospel was precisely the movement in the church that said that churches have to be involved in struggles for social justice. It just isn't enough to merely preach about heaven or even preach about equality. The church needs to plunge into ordinary political struggles for justice that are consistent with the liberationist founding of the Black church and the abolitionist tradition. That quite simple thing is the essential thing in the social gospel. It's what we need, and that's why I'm going to talk about this in a little while. When I mapped out a darkly radiant vision, it's a very complicated story. It's every bit as complicated as Volume 1 was, because I've got all this diversity to deal with, and I got to find ways of holding it together, keeping it a conversation while giving each difference its due as to why it's different. And yet when I'm mapping that all out in my head and thinking about how I'm going to get all marshaled together this chorus of very variegated people, I did have in mind in my head that I've got to drive to a point where I get to certain people who are just so quintessential to what this social gospel is in every generation that you could have put them in any generation and they would just show up as who they are. You could recognize it, that indeed there's something right here at the center of it, because there are always people at the margin saying, I'm in with 1 foot, right? I'd like to be in this, but I've got my issues with it, right? And of course that happens with every movement. But I needed to end with certain figures who are just so quintessential that no matter what generation you're in, you'd say that's the social gospel right there. And so that's how I ended Darkly Radiant Version. That's how it is that I landed. I was Tracy Blackman and William Barber and Ebony Marshall Dorrien and several others, Willie Jennings and others, and one more that I'm going to talk a little bit more about here later on. So I'm a little bit set up. I'm setting myself up now for a question that I know is coming later on. Yeah, maybe is how we can get there.
Yeah. So the next question is that in the lecture you briefly mentioned Walter Fluker, and could you say a bit more about how his work relates to the lecture more broadly?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thanks, Trip. Yeah, this is a probably pretty good time for this, as it involves a little deeper plunge into certain things and that are very much in the lecture. It's also true. Yeah, I mentioned him only briefly, partly because, yeah, if I kind of open this up, there's just too much to get into with regard to Walter's whole career, and especially the argument that he landed on in the latter part of his career. So, firstly, I need to say, since I didn't really even explain this in the lecture, he's just one in a blizzard of people that I'm talking about in the lecture there. I should say, for people who don't know, who Walter Fluker is a very eminent Black social gospel ethicist. In fact, I wrote a little note to myself here to help me recite his many titles, because Walter has held prestigious positions at most of the crown jewel institutions of the Black social gospel. All right, so just listen to this. Okay, where is it? There it is. Okay. Dean of Black Church Studies and Martin Luther King Professor at Colgate Rochester Divinity School. Director of the Andrew Young Center and Coca-Cola Professor of Leadership Studies, Morehouse College. Martin Luther King Professor and Director of the Howard Thurman Papers Project, Boston University. Dean Professor of Spirituality, Ethics, and Leadership, Emory University. And Distinguished Professor of the Howard Thurman Center at Hartford International University. All right, so that's a list you have to read. I doubt that even Walter can rattle off that list without a card. Yet, Walter grew up in the Bucket of Blood district of Southside Chicago, which was a place of desperate loneliness, poverty, and violence. For the first half of his career, he wrote books on the exemplary leadership of Martin Luther King and Howard Thurman, mining their careers for examples of how to fight racism by standing on gospel values. He loved the historic identification of the Black church with Psalm 118. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Black churches, the cornerstone, understand white America better than it understands itself. So they're distinctly qualified to speak about the soul of America and to produce moral leaders. Progressive white churches, he said, are much too self-marginalized and relativistic to produce moral leaders. Only the Black church tradition of social Christianity offers a serious counterword to the politicized Christian right. This was Walter's core theme until 2008, when the Christian right got serious about hijacking Martin Luther King, fortified by a best-selling book by Clarence Jones titled, What Would Martin Say? Yeah, what would Martin say? Clarence Jones was politically conservative and proudly upper class. He had also been Dr. King's lawyer. He said that King was not the lefty progressive that the Democratic Party canonized. Far from it. King was remarkably like Jones, a Republican conservative. Had King lived into the present time, Jones said, he would have opposed affirmative action and been appalled by Jesse Jackson. According to Jones, King was repelled by spoiled welfare recipients, a drag on society, he called them, and he claimed that King would have supported strict immigration laws and enforcement. Jones even channeled a King who cheered for the invasion of Iraq. King would have said that Iraq got what it deserved. The political right quoted Jones gleefully, happy to pit King against, folks like us. In Walter's early career, he would have just rushed in to defend King from all these positions that Jones projected onto him. But by 2008, Walter was more skeptical and postmodern than his earlier self. And more important, he had tired of the dilemma drama in which Black Americans are called upon to save American democracy. Walter made two prefatory points before getting to his point. One, the Jones episode was another iteration of a tired trope about heroic Martin Luther King being succeeded by scam artists, opportunists, and flunkies. The only difference, he said, was that Jones argued from the political right. But two, the whole business of appealing to King, he said, has become dubious in a postmodern era of post-blackness. All historic figures get recycled for agendas that they knew nothing about. Walter began a process of pondering a reframing argument, which goes to the very framing that I was, featured in his lecture. He took his first pass at it in 2013. And in 2016, there was a book version. It's titled, "The Ground Has Shifted, The Future of the Black Church in Post-Racial America." He said that as long as Black Americans identify with American democracy, the Jones argument is a plausible perspective. Black Americans have moved, he said, or are in the process of moving, or at least should move, from dilemma to diaspora, from exodus to exile, and from the frying pan to the fire. Black Americans are a diasporic people who have never had a home in the USA. Thus, they are due to relinquish the dilemma framework that Du Bois, Gunnar Myrdal, and King took for granted. King was a global citizen who thought he had a home in the USA. Fluker drops the American dilemma and the double consciousness that goes with it in the name of diasporic global citizenship. All right, well, exodus to exile is a complementary frame, this time, of course, in biblical categories. The biblical narrative of exodus from slavery is obviously powerful in the Black church tradition and liberation theology. But in the Bible, it only applied to Hebrew slaves, and it justified the slaughter of Canaanites, as Dolores Williams emphasized. Fluker judges that the exodus motif no longer works for liberationist ends. Meanwhile, the Afro-Pentecostal and holiness churches are growing, and they never operated with an oppressed versus oppressor framework. The sanctified church has always had an exiled consciousness. It's hard to find a home in the wilderness. It is hard to be heard in the wilderness. Fluker sometimes catches himself when he writes in this mode, because he remembers all those titles around his neck. But he does acknowledge the moral authority of those who shout in the wilderness. They do not assume responsibility for the right ordering of the world. They speak for themselves, crying out from their wild, lonely, broken, alienated, not belonging anywhere homelessness, which is what Fluker calls being cast from the frying pan into the fire. To be thrown into the fire, not belonging anywhere, is exactly what Martin Luther King opposed. He said he was somebody, and so is every child of God. Fluker says that King's personalism was a static philosophy based on the Enlightenment dualism of mind and body, so it's discredited in postmodern terms. It is true that one stream of personalist idealism is dualistic, atemporal, and individualistic. The Bone and Knudsen stream, has all those characteristics. But King was steeped in the neo-Hegelian personalism of his teacher, Edgar Brightman, which was not dualistic. It was not atemporal, and it was certainly not based on his substantive self. Fluker says that King had to overcome his idealism to struggle for justice, which is the very opposite of what King said. So, I don't accept Fluker's rendering of King or his verdict that homeless Black Americans are thrown into the fire. But I wholly endorse his claim that the calling of church leaders today is to wake the dead. The same global capitalist forces that create walled-off enclaves in the larger society have driven middle-class Black churches further from the world of the Black poor, which is the very thing that King despaired about in his last years. To wake the dead, Fluker argues, I think brilliantly, Black Christians must congregate, rallying their diminished communities and conjure a better future than the one mapped out by global capitalism and the prosperity gospel, and conspire to just make a difference in a time when you're just lined up against weather forces against you, just relentless. The Black social gospel of the future cannot capitulate to the selfish, commercial individualism of the prosperity gospel. I think that is exactly right. Uh-oh.
Aaron, you muted yourself.
Oh, good.
Oh, sorry. I thought I had unmuted. So we're returning back to Warnock. You didn't mention Senator Raphael Warnock, the lecture. How do you see his significance in the Black social gospel and in relation to the lecture for this week?
Thank you. Yes. So as I just set myself up for saying, because I knew this question was coming, Raphael is one of those people that I just had it lined out this way, that I was going to end up landing on him. And I was going to get there whether or not he won his race for the U.S. Senate. Because at the time when I'm doing all this, this is 2020, I didn't know that he was going to win his race. But then he becomes this enormously important figure in our political life. Raphael grew up in a public housing project in Savannah. His parents were Pentecostal pastors. He graduated from Morehouse College. In 91, he enrolled at Union, where Jim Cohn picked him out. Jim surveyed his classes in search of the next important Black theologian. Raphael had everything that he looked for in a theologian: strong identification with Blackness, humble beginnings, brilliance, passion, teachability, courage. Cohn pinned his hopes for Black theology on Warnock, which became a heavy burden to bear when Raphael joined the ministry staff at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. Jim was hard on Raphael, angry at him for failing to complete his dissertation, and for treating ministry as more important than his academic career. Once I arrived at Union, I also learned that Jim was angry because if Raphael ever did complete his dissertation, it was going to make an argument that Jim did not like. It was the Wilmore argument that Black theology falls short of what it should be because it's too enclosed in the academy. Warnock served at Douglas Church in Baltimore, and in 2005, he was called to Ebenezer Church in Atlanta. He asked Jim to speak at his installation, and Jim refused, refusing to be mollified. Meanwhile, that dissertation hung like a stone cloud over his head. Raphael ran out of extensions at Union, and he pressed very hard to meet his last deadline, which was in March of 2006. He produced a manuscript that is now a landmark in the field, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, and he kept working on Cohn. He just refused for them to be not reconciled. So eventually he wore him down, and they were reconciled in those last years. So that's all just because, Raphael is just someone who could not accept that he was in some ways alienated from Jim. All right. So, as the title of this book suggests, the book does contend that the religious identity of the Black church is itself a form of double consciousness. The Black church was founded on Black struggle and white revivalism, two things that never quite fit together. Raphael said the contradictions between the liberationist and evangelical strands of Black Christianity have never been resolved. 4 overlapping moments failed to solve the problem. The founding moment was the formation of a liberationist faith, the invisible institution of slave religion. The second moment was the founding of a liberationist church amid the Second Great Awakening. Black Christians conflated their passion for freedom with Christian doctrine, without questioning the theological integrity of an inherited evangelical orthodoxy. They simply puzzled that white Christians failed to live by their faith, or even recognize that their racism was a problem. The third moment was the Civil Rights Movement, which relied on the evangelical faith of the Black church and the charisma of spellbinder preachers. The fourth moment was liberation theology, which repudiated white Christianity as anti-Christian. Warnock did not, at least back then, he didn't ask if there might be something off about Cohen's rendering of Black church history, including Cohen's claim that he and Roberts were the first Black theologians. What did strike him, however, was that how to put this? I was going to go for a longer version of this, but it's just too long. What did strike him was that C. Eric Lincoln described the Black church in 1974 as a bold, self-conscious, strident phoenix. Raphael had grown up in the Black church, and he knew it is no phoenix. It struck him that the phoenix argument was much like the God is dead argument in white theology. These white theologians who said that God needs to die so that religion might grow up. Only in white religion was such a thing as atheist theology imaginable. Black Christians didn't talk about the death of God or fathom how atheist theology could even exist. Raphael said that if Lincoln and Cohen could reach for a trope that was so alien to the culture of Black Christianity, they must have been remarkably alienated from the Black church. Identifying the Black church with Black power was very much like imagining what white Christianity would be if God is a fairy tale. If that's liberation theology, what was the inheritance? Warnock said, firstly, liberation theology is a very good thing, but secondly, its inheritance belongs way too much in the academy. Black Christianity, a product of 4 liberation movements and an evangelical hermeneutic, must integrate its liberationist underpinnings by reclaiming the political character of the gospel. The church needs theology that helps the church become what liberation theology says it is. The social gospel is what helps the church do that. Warnock said the next phase of Black theology must be led by pastors who labor in the trenches, who exude the best aspects of Black spirituality and love the Black church and demand more of it. Theology professors must be rooted in the church. Church pastors must ground their congregations in good theology. Activists must build organizations, bridge the divide between prosperity churches and Martin Luther King churches. Raphael has preached that message throughout his career. And look where it took him. You just can't say, oh, well, this is a story about something in the past. I mean, look at what has been achievable on the basis of these very things. And so this is a story that's very much living in our time, and I think with a full wealth and spiritual power of the gospel. All right.
Yeah. In your memoir, you tell a story about one of your last conversations with James Cone before he died. It was about the history and the future of Black theology. What was the discussion then, and what does it mean for the present?
Oh goodness, yes. Thank you, Trip. Yeah, very near the end of his life. Jim asked me about Vincent Lloyd, who's a prolific Black theologian at Villanova. Maybe he was thinking about his possible successor at Union. I don't know. Maybe it bothered him that there's this upcoming Black theologian out there who's written a bunch of books, but he doesn't know much about. Maybe he had just seen a reference to Vincent's new book, Religion of the Field Negro, because it had just come out a couple of weeks earlier. I didn't ask him what caused him to ask, and so now, I've wondered ever since. But I went straight for the new book because it made a framing argument about the history of Black theology. Vincent Lloyd said that Black theology, in its original phase, was strongly theological, making spirited, normative, aggressive claims about God and Christ and the judgments of God and the evils of white Christianity and the idolatry of white theology. Then, he said, Black theology entered a second phase, when secularism and its conjoined twin, multiculturalism, crept into it, reducing it to one of many ways to pluralize theology. Black theology lost its nerve. It was not very theological anymore, being more concerned to pass secular, academic, multicultural tests, civility, and diversity. Historicists, feminists, womanists, deconstructionists, post-structuralists, and secular religious studies scholars all played roles in taming Black theology. But even Cone went along with relativizing critiques that stripped his early work of its power. Lloyd argued that the third phase commenced with the rise of Black Lives Matter. It has no theological exemplars, he said, but they are surely coming. Because Black Lives Matter is closer to the Black Power movement than anything that existed between 1975 and 2010. All right, I laid this all up. Jim said, there's something to it, isn't there? What do you think? And I said, well, yeah, this frame certainly describes something familiar, but it doesn't do enough sorting, accomplish what frames are usually supposed to do. Phase 1 is pretty brief. And then phase 2, it's almost the entire history of Black theology lumped together in all its variations. And then phase 3 is just a blank space. But I did add, in the spring of 2018, that Jim's forthcoming memoir was more like his first two books than any of the others. He said, that's what I mean. There is something to it. We lost him shortly after that. And there is an acute sense in which for many years I was more aware of Jim's feelings than of my own. For years, he and I would go to sessions at AAR, and I had radar for how people, how he experienced the people in the room and what they said. He had a little bit of patience for deconstructionist jargon. And he had slightly more patience for radical orthodoxy jargon. But both were pretty quickly exhausted. He would get that look on his face, and I would just cringe in my seat until he said, okay, I can't take it anymore. And now we're out of there. Jim could readily name every Black theologian that he mentored and where they taught. Seeing them at AAR was a highlight for him every year. As for how Black theology developed, all right, first leaving aside the entire field of social ethics, which is just something else, I would mention especially Kelly Douglas, Dolores Williams, Dwight Hopkins, Monica Coleman, J. Cameron Carter, Willie James Jennings, and today, Raymond Carr. All right, Kelly and Dolores, I've already discussed in these live streams. Dwight Hopkins combined Cohn's political hermeneutic and Wilmore's cultural hermeneutic in a disciplined fashion that made room for womanist criticism, also in a way that we've discussed in earlier weeks, and which made a huge contribution to the field. Dwight recognized that combining liberal and liberationist criticism is a real option. But of course, he spent much of his career imploring against it. That's what we must not do. And that sort of determination helped to guide him through a whole thicket of problems. Monica Coleman and Jay Carter came out of the gate with arguments that defined whole new eras of womanism and Black theology. And the course of doing just immediately, they made everyone deal with them. Monica said that she was no less a Black feminist than a womanist. So she could only be a womanist on wave 3 kind of postmodern terms, not on the communal terms of existing womanism. Moreover, in her case, importantly to some of us, womanist theology included a robust commitment to process theology. Jay said the entire history of Black theology was enclosed within the anti-metaphysical horizon of modern Protestant white supremacist theology, so it was faithfully limited as an expression of Black spiritual being in the world. I'll come back to Jay in a moment. Willie Jennings is currently undertaking, in my view, the most important, creative, and valuable work of anyone in contemporary theology, period. He had his signature focus from the beginning in his landmark book, The Christian Imagination, tracking the ways by which racial existence powerfully shapes human subjects and subjectivity itself. Willie and Jay, in their early careers, similarly explored how racial reasoning arose, how it perverted Christianity, and how it infected and structured Christian theology and subjectivity. Willie's current work carries forward this focus on the structuring, distorting, and deforming powers of racial formation in shaping minds and character, both within and beyond theology. Beyond theology, he has a profound critique of mastery talk and education itself. He says that the cultivation of possession and mastery is colonialist through and through. Christian theology has yet to fully grapple with the catastrophe of the slave trade, even though historians have by now profusely described it. Theologians still, to this day, routinely describe a conceptual chain linking the Bible to Irenaeus and Augustine, to medieval theology, to modern theology, to contemporary theology. The earthquake of slave trading is rarely allowed to disrupt the chain linking modern Christianity to previous generations. The world changed in the 15th century, but theologians do not operate as though their subject changed. That reality is what's underneath and just fueling all this work, this kind of gushing of work Willie is producing today. Willie says, poetically, that when God's feet touched the soil in the incarnation of Christ, God was in rhythm. The very rhythm that God by which God created creation itself. Thus, God gave birth to musicality. This is the keynote of Raymond Carr's very recent aesthetic fusion of Thelonious Monk, Toni Morrison, Karl Barth, and James Gunn. Carr plays in Monk's music, improvising on the melody in Monk's fashion. The melody is given, as Bart McCone would say. So the aesthetically attuned theologian listens for the melody of the divine in the world. Carr's ongoing work, I think, is a sign of the vitality of Black theology. Meanwhile, I need to add a heads up about one more such sign. My brilliant doctoral student, Zachary Royal, is taking up the challenge that Jay Carter threw out there 20 years ago. If Carter was right, that Black theology too readily assumed the domesticated strictures of modern Protestantism, but Cone was right about ontological blackness, Black theology might resume Carter's abandoned project by conjuring ontological blackness with metaphysical audacity. Well, stay tuned for that project.
Oh, now that is a temptation there, Gary.
That's right. Yeah, you're just leaving us hanging there. But we have to go to another figure whom we talked about earlier in week 2, but we need to kind of hit one aspect of this. Niebuhr here. The question reads, Reinhold Niebuhr was apparently a Christian Zionist. Can you discuss if his Zionism was theological, political, or both?
Oh, thank you. Here, okay, my eye is on the clock here, so I gotta figure out how to say a bunch of things here, but as long as I'm inclined to go. Well, given that it's already 2:04. All right, the first thing to say about this, is just to acknowledge something. Yes, just to put it as straight as possible, I guess. Reinhold Niebuhr is the patron saint of liberal Christian Zionism. He was the right generation for believing that liberal, Christian, and Zionist are names that go together perfectly well. I think I'll take the theological question first before moving to the political one. Firstly, because Niebuhr did have a theology, contrary to the many who say that he was predominantly secular or political or pragmatic, and that his theology was wholly unlike the kind. Well, the next important thing to say here is because so many people say, that he actually has no theology, then they just say, well, then his Zionism is simply secular political. And actually, that demeans the fact that Niebuhr is always theological in this very kind of pragmatic political activism that he's involved in. Nonetheless, and this is the second thing that needs to be said, his theology was wholly unlike the kind that later overtook Christian Zionism. It's why we even kind of steer around this, right? When we did Niebuhr a couple weeks ago, we didn't even come anywhere near this subject because that's like, it just feels like it's too much to go into. And yet then we got pushback from people saying, wait a minute, are you not going to talk about this? So yes, we need to try here. Niebuhr was a bastard during the generation that fundamentalists lost the battle for the historic Protestant denominations and broke away to establish their own vast network of new denominations, Bible institutes, evangelism conferences, and radio ministries. It embarrassed him that authoritarian forms of Protestantism still existed. Niebuhr said plainly that they should have expired long ago. The fame of Billy Graham was especially embarrassing to him. How could any college graduate of the 20th century believe in half the things that Graham said? He said Niebuhr was just aggressively scathing on this subject. So, his brand of Christian Zionism had nothing to do with believing that the Abrahamic land promises of Genesis 12, 15, and 17 expressed God's permanent will, or that dispensationalism is a credible interpretation of the Bible? Niebuhr would never claim that the restoration of the Jews to Palestine was a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, or it's a precursor of the apocalypse, or any such thing, since this entire religious mentality was utterly foreign to him. He had a theological doctrine of providence as the rule of God over history. God stands outside of history, judging our sin, while Christ represents the mercy of this judgment, the forgiveness that makes God's holy judgment bearable. The human spirit finds a home and catches a glimpse of its freedom in God's transcendence. But the self also finds in transcendence the limit of the self's freedom, a divine judgment against human pride and divine mercy for sin. To Niebuhr, history is the sphere of tragedy, sin, and conflict in which God's purpose is never to be identified with any particular thing or any course of action. History moves toward the realization of the kingdom of God, yet every occasion of its realization falls under divine judgment. All nations and authorities stand under the judgment of God. The biblical notion of divine transcendence for Niebuhr relativizes the claims of other authorities, ordering the world under what Peter Berger later called a sacred canopy. Niebuhr taught that biblical religion sanctions a pluralism of social authorities and institutions which hold off the will to power of each other and against each other and the state. All right. As I just said in a fumbling kind of way, so many writers claim that Niebuhr is only pragmatic and political because they think his theology is meaningless if it doesn't have any acts of God in history. Niebuhr brushed off these people in his lifetime, since he figured rightly that they demanded something that he just couldn't deliver. There was also a group that called itself atheist for Niebuhr, but, he took delight that they existed. The most sophisticated, I'm going to take a detour here for just a moment because I haven't gotten this far into it. The most sophisticated Niebuhrian doctrine of providence ever developed was the one that Niebuhr's best protege, Langdon Gilkey, developed in the 1960s and 70s. Gilkey began by demolishing the neo-Orthodox claim that neo-Orthodoxy is based on the recital of God's objective activity in special biblical events. He showed that neo-Orthodox theologians had no more objective basis than the liberals they disparaged. They retrieved the biblical language about God speaking and acting, but they never explained what God actually did in any of these so-called mighty acts of God in the Bible. From there, Gilkey went on to develop his doctrine of providence, which fused the signature tropes of his two mentors, Niebuhr and Tillich, with help from Whitehead and Jürgen Moltmann. God acts in and through the secondary causes of destiny and freedom. God is the divine power of being that sustains the historical movement of being, as in liberal theology. But freedom, he emphasized, is not only on the side of the good. Freedom can also become sin. The possibilities open to freedom can be betrayed. Destiny can become fate. John Calvin taught that believing in providence includes believing that God's creative sovereignty is at work in everything, including things that provoke the divine judgment. Gilkey translated that into Niebuhrian terms. Believing in providence is to expect new possibilities to emerge from tragedy, oppression, faith, and the divine judgment. Of course, some of us here would say that, would throw in the lore here is before we at least get to the divine judgment. So, Niebuhr was a theologian of providence who exuded his immense love of the USA and England, and who was ambivalently proud of his German heritage, and who grew up with immense respect for the ethical character of Hebrew faith. He was prone to a stronger pro-Jewish perspective than most Americans of his time because his father was a lonely leader type who read the Bible in Hebrew and Greek, instilling in his children, all of them, an appreciation of Hebrew faith. Niebuhr was deeply self-conscious about the cultural advantages he inherited from his father because he owed his entire career to them. He imbibed intellectualism, languages, democratic social philosophy, and high-minded Christian seriousness from his father. There was no family in Wright City or Lincoln that was remotely like the Niebuhr family, which produced two great theologians. Yeah, when Niebuhr got to Yale, he grieved that he didn't belong there, but he knew what got him in the door. His eloquent writings were subsequently strewn with slurs against purportedly inferior peoples and cultures, especially when he warmed to the subject about all those Arab countries surrounding Israel. In this respect, he did recycle typical white supremacism, American supremacism, and Western supremacism. He constantly measured the cultural advancement of others because he's so highly self-conscious about his own. When he began his ministry in Detroit, he was already a keen student of the different kinds of Zionism. The version of Zionism that persuaded him was the one that Louis Brandeis propounded during World War I. Jews are a distinct nationality, scattered and abused among the nations. Every Jew is necessarily a member of this distinct Jewish nation, and the modern democratic struggle for freedom must include equal opportunity for nationalities, not only to individuals. Niebuhr warned throughout the mid and later 1930s that Jews were threatened with extinction in Nazi Germany. He forged many of his closest friendships with people in the New York socialist orbit who shared his alarm. They remain his foremost allies when he left the Socialist Party, when he later founded the Union for Democratic Action, and later folded the UDA into the Americans for Democratic Action, and later on stumped for Cold War liberalism. In the midst of all that, in 1942, in a two-part article for The Nation magazine titled Jews After the War, Niebuhr updated the Brandeis argument, contending that Jews have rights as a people, not only as individuals. They deserve a homeland, and the homeland must be in Palestine. He said plainly that he did not know how to arbitrate what he called the ancient title of the Jews to Palestine against the longtime possession of this same land by Palestinian Arabs. He cautioned that there's no ground of moral judgment on this subject that is not shaped and was not shaped by the very historical forces that were in conflict. Moreover, he said, whenever religion is brought in to establish or settle a claim, it's almost always a demonic pretension. One of his favorite phrases. Niebuhr was a co-founder during World War II of the American Christian Palestine Committee. After the war, he conducted lecture tours calling for a Jewish state in Palestine. He aligned himself mostly with Martin Buber and Ernst Simon, Jewish intellectuals in Palestine who said that Jews and Arabs must find a way to share the land of Palestine. But Buber and Simon called for a binational state. Niebuhr thought, that's like American socialism. It's an attractive idea, but it'll never happen. For similar reasons, he was against incorporating a doctrine of human rights into the Charter of the United Nations. Niebuhr said, human rights is an overbelief that undermines what might be achievable. Treaties, free trade, stuff like that. In 1947, he was a major player in the movement that implored the United Nations to partition Palestine. Niebuhr said the so-called Jewish problem was nothing more or less than the right of Jews to survive as a people. Jewish Palestinians, he said, were the only force for progress, modernization, and liberal democracy in the Middle East. Later on in later years, sometimes when he made this argument, he'd say, oh, well, Christian Lebanon too, maybe them, give them secondary status. But really, this is always an argument about the superiority of the culture of Jewish Palestinians. Niebuhr argued that religion did have a role to play in Zionism, but Zionism was always about something bigger than the Jewish religion, the national will of a people to live. He cautioned from the beginning in 1948 that Israel's victory was morally ambiguous. You could say, well, yeah, Niebuhr says that about anything, so he gets no real credit for saying it about this. But nonetheless, he's surrounded by people who don't, they just want to celebrate what's happened here. And he does always push back with Niebuhrian ambiguity about that. He received reports from missionaries about atrocities committed against Arab Palestinians, and he made some weak counter gestures, contending that Palestinians should be resettled and they should be compensated for their losses. Of course, he knew that dispossession was the crucial issue, but any talk about the right of return was just too much. In that context, or any time later, jeopardizing what might be achievable. For the rest of his life, Niebuhr expressed a moderate degree of sympathy for the suffering of Palestinians. Edward Said, writing in 1979, said that Niebuhr had perfect pitch for the typical American liberal purpose of putting a moral gloss on the subjection and oppression of Palestinians, and somehow their willingness to just keep going by where you just watch it going on, and somehow it's just never a time to change history. Well, first, he did live long enough to witness the 67 war and the occupation of the West Bank and the first stage of the unraveling of liberal Zionism. His daughter, Elizabeth, who was a beloved friend to me, demanded during the unraveling that his name be removed from the masthead of the magazine that he founded and loved, Christianity in Crisis. In the 1970s, when progressive Christianity changed, Elizabeth and her mother Ursula just couldn't bear to read Christianity in Crisis. Liberal Christian Zionism and liberal anti-communism both retained a high moral stature to them, and for complementary reasons. I never doubted through the 1970s and 80s that Niebuhr would have supported the position of the democratic socialist organizations, the progressive Christian organizations, and the Tikkun magazine community to which I belonged. There must be a two-state solution bordered more or less by the Green Line, the pre-1967 border. I never doubted in the 1990s Niebuhr would have supported the Oslo Accords. These positions were so conventional that many books were written on Niebuhr during this period, just passed over this entire issue, except for its connection to the Cold War. When I entered the field, Niebuhr was the theologian of the Cold War. Everything else was secondary. Well, the world is very different today. It is still true that two historic peoples with rival narratives have to find a way to share the land and respect each other's right to self-determination and safety with no appeal to anybody's purported supremacy. You can't brutally oppress people any without driving them to desperate rebellion. Palestinian children are every bit as precious as Israeli children and no less deserving of a decent future. Reinhold Niebuhr is one of my heroes, so I wish he could be quoted this categorically on this issue. But he always intertwined Christian ethics with the language of statecraft and power politics. And he never took a position in his entire career that cut against an American national security or economic interest. That was what he called realism. I respect realism very much and am never lacking in realistic judgment. But I would never call myself a Niebuhrian realist because it lacks a basis for saying that a legitimate American interest is morally out of play. The Oslo Accords of 1993 were supposed to deliver a Palestinian state by 1999. Instead, Israeli settlers doubled from 200,000 to 400,000, while the Oslo process disintegrated over settlers, the second intifada, Jerusalem, secure borders, and above all, the right of return. Then came 2 decades of vicious cynicism, extremism, and so-called mowing the lawn, which led to the horror of the past 3 years. Today, right now, there's nothing to hope for in Palestine. There is only the ongoing slaughter and devastation, financed in large measure by our tax dollars. For many years, the two-state solution was the gold standard of realistic idealism. It was presumably the one attainable alternative to occupation and oppression and mutual hatred. None of us can know how many people must die before the calculus changes on what is unrealistic or intolerable. But today, it's actually easier to imagine a binational state or one nation with equal rights for all than to imagine a two-state outcome. Though right now, all of these things are just light years from where we.
Friends, this is our final session. 6 weeks on the social gospel and social ethics, and some of the figures when we thought you ought to know about, not because they're stellar in every way. Certainly, the focus here on Niebuhr's Zionism should show there are reprehensible and abhorrent things that we need to point to, and there are others that are equally complicated and that we need to face. I want to, Gary, if you want to have any, I saw you just kind of go there a little bit. Do you want to say anything else here for last words?
Thank you. I'm grateful for this whole experience, and I'm going to miss it, actually. So, thank you.
I'll do this, so maybe Trip won't do it.
We'll find out.
You might do it too. You can friends, come to Kansas City. Be with Gary, be with Cornell, be with many others. Come to Kansas City for Theology Beer Camp. It will be a wonderful set of several days of deep discussions, a time when you can probably approach Gary in the hall and ask him about questions. Say, I was there. Thank you for the classes. But yes, the conversation does not have to end. Tell your friends. I hope the one thing for me about this, I hope that you all have caught the spirit of social ethics that inspires so much of why I love it and find it as a distinct and important home to do good work that combines deep on the ground organizing. So I'm really thankful for Joe and Colleen and Carolyn and Charlene for having joined us, and Cynthia and others who had supplemental interviews. But this is where really things begin by allowing the place of the movements to direct the academic questions, to going to the places of suffering and letting that inform the academic work that you do. So this is why we wanted to do the course, and honestly, just because it's good to get Trip and Gary together. This is fun. So thank you, Trip, and thank you, Gary.
Oh, this has been awesome. Thank you so much to both of you, all the different guests that participated in different ways. And huge thanks to everyone that watched lectures and sent some amazing questions. It's been a real treat. And not every class do I get the thank you emails from working clergy, organizers, students at early and graduate school, not sure with their religious relationship,
Right.
to retirees who finally got to read the books they've wanted to read. And all of them have sent messages of like, thank you, or this is the question that's there. And I think that says a lot about your work, Gary, and all the different stories, narratives, and thinkers that you've woven to this class. So I deeply appreciate it. And yeah, I think you were right when you mentioned earlier about Warnock's question about the difficulty of those in the academy to be grounded in the church and those in the church to benefit from the academy. And that's been one of the reasons you've been an inspiration to me, is that you're a theologian of the church with peak intellectual rigor and integrity grounded in the movement and in the congregation. And multiple people have noticed that and celebrated it. And our mutual friend, my advisor, Philip Clayton, called yesterday and gave me a 40-minute monologue about how much he's enjoyed the whole series.
Thank you, Trip. Wow. Oh, goodness. Thank
But, you know,
you.
as someone that wants to have their feet in both, it is a real treat to get to, work with you in this arrangement, and very excited to get to hang out in person again in Kansas City. So thank you, everybody. And we'll hopefully see you all again soon. And Gary, if you get lonely and want to play around on the internet, you just have to let me know. It's not hard. It's not hard. And next time I won't withhold all the process relational asides, and we can have all of it next time.
Okay.
All right.
Thank y'all.
Bye.